Welcome to lecture 29 of the course CS213 Object Oriented Programming of the Kohat University of Science and Technology. In this lecture, we will briefly discuss Java database connectivity. We will talk about how we can connect to a database on our hard disk and how can we use basic SQL or SQL to interact with that database. Databases are needed when we need to store data permanently, and we need to store large amount of data permanently that we can later on retrieve into our variables or data members in our Java program. Although we will not go into details of how databases are created and how databases are normalized, but we'll have a basic overview of how we can connect to a database from a Java program. All data values are simple, no arrays, pointers, vectors, complex types. In a database, all data are stored as 2D tables or relations. That is in a relational database that we'll look into, where data is in the form of tables. The tables contains 0 or more rows, are also called rows are also called tuples, and it can contains one or more columns or attributes. So the values that we are going to retrieve into our variables are going to be stored in columns, and each row will show a record for a set of variables. So we can say that for each object we will have a row, and for each data member in our object we will have a column. All operations are defined logically. The order of tuples or rows does not matter in our table. Keys are used to identify unique tuples. JDBC, what it is, basically it stands for Java Database Connectivity. It's an API for database programs. It's a Java API for connecting programs written in Java to the data in relational databases. It consists of classes and interfaces written in the Java programming language. It provides a standard API for tool or database developers and makes it possible to write database applications using a pure Java API. It relies on vendor supplied drivers. We will need to load or install drivers to be able to connect to our DBMSs or different kinds of database systems that are available, but we can simply load that into our Java project, and we will be able to connect to the different kinds of databases. Now there are open database connectivity like ODBC and JDBC. JDBC is Java based, ODBC is more general. It is installed on host machine, is written in C. Java or JDBC, we can download different jar files and we can attach those files to our Java project, and then we will be able to connect to our databases. So it has some classes like general, date, time steps, etc. Driver manager that we'll look into, and then it has interfaces that we'll need to be able to connect or establish a connection to our database. Like that connection interface, it is used to communicate with the database. A statement, we'll need an object of the statement interface that can be a prepared statement or a callable that is used to package SQL. Then we'll have a result set, an object of the result set interface that is used to iterate through the query result or cursor. Basically we can load our table into the result set, and then we can traverse through the table from within our program. Database metadata, a result set. Metadata contains data about the data. The metadata is usually the information or the detail that we need to require about the database. For example, the data types of our columns, etc., the number of columns in our tables. These are the different details that we have about the data. The steps that we need to follow to manipulate our database is loading the driver, connecting to the database, manipulating the data, and closing the database. We need to remember these steps. We need to have a driver to in order to be able to establish a connection with our database, and in most of the cases we'll be installing that driver and we'll be attaching it to our project or Java or project. Without the driver, we won't be able to communicate with our database. Then we need to establish a connection with our database, and we then can manipulate the data using mainly the SQL structured query language, and that we will have a look into some of the basic statements of the SQL in later part of this lecture. And then we need to remember that we need to close the database once we are done with the manipulation. The manipulation can be creating some new data into the database, it can be selecting data from the database, it can be insertion or updation or deleting some data from our database. So we need to load the driver. We can load it explicitly by the through the for name function and calling the driver name. This creates a new instance of the driver. Implicitly update the Java system settings. And then we need to connect to the database through the get connection method. It's a static method, and we can pass the different values. For example, we need to pass the name of the database, the user ID, and the password to the data to the get connection method of the driver manager class, and then we will be able to establish a connection with the database. We need to remember that we need to pass the whole address of our database, and we'll see how we can obtain this address after we have created our database, especially on our host machine or our local machine. Will this basically shows the address of our database on the server machine. Since in our case our server will be our own computer or laptop, therefore we will be using the address of our database on our machine, that is shown by this address, the host address. We can manipulate the data using different statements. We'll be using a create statement method that establishes a framework for executing queries. Queries are the statements that we write in the SQL language, the structured query language, that can be used to insert data into the database, create a table in our database, delete some data from the database, or we can also update some data in our database. Execute query returns a result set. We will be using the execute query method to extract data from our database and load that data into an object of the result set interface in our program. Execute update returns an int. It is the method that updates data in the database and returns an int that shows the number of rows that were updated in the table of the database. And there is execute method that can return either, but it is usually used when there is no data to return. DDL and DCL queries are generally run using execute. We'll have a look at these, what do the DDL and the DCL mean in a little while. DML queries are generally run using execute update. The return value represents the number of rows affected. DQL queries are generally run using execute query. A collection of tuples is returned. The result set, a cursor that interacts through a collection of tuples. It's forward only, and each statement object can have at most one active result set. We'll have a look at it when we retrieve data from our database. We store it in an object of the result set, and at the time it will have one row in the data in our result set. We can use that result set to go through the data in our database, or we can use that result set to insert or update data in our database. Metadata lets you know what the database looks like. Information about the table names, field names, domains, etc. Metadata exists for both the database, effectively constant, and for each result set depends on the query. So we can have the metadata about our database or the individual tables in our database. Important metadata methods will be column count, which will show us the number of fields in a result set. Column type as listed of column I. Note that columns are 1 indexed, not 0. That means that columns start from 1. The counting of the columns start from 1. The return value of column type can be used to select the correct get method to invoke on the result set. Possible uses of JDBC can be leverage Java's GUI tools to allow users to visualize the contents of a database. So basically we can load data from our database and we can visualize the data on our JFrame forms or frames. So we can create an interface for the database in our GUI, and we can store the data in the database. Use Java to publish information stored in a database on the web. We can connect the database to the web through Java. Create tools to aid the database programmer in designing queries, or we can create queries for our database using JDBC. SQL, we'll have a brief look before we go into the detail of how we can establish a connection in our program. Data definition language. The DDL stands for data definition language and includes creating relations or attributes. So create is a statement in SQL, and it is used for creating relations or columns, and or the relations over here mean the tables in our database and the columns in that database. Data manipulation language or DML that we just talked about in a little while ago. Insert, update or delete data. So these are the statements that are used for manipulating the database or the data in our database. Insert statement, update statement or a delete statement. We will look at the examples of these statements in our practical part of this lecture. Data control language or DCL. Grant, revoke privileges. We can grant or revoke privileges from the users of our programs or the users that have access to the database. We can grant the different levels of accesses to our users. Data query language that has the select statement that selects data from relations. It will select the data from the table that we want and show that data on our form or in our console screen. Now let's have a look at how we can establish a connection to a basic console-based Java program. First of all, we need to understand that what are the type of classes and interfaces that we need to import. We need to remember that these are the 5 interfaces and classes that at least we need to have an import for each class or each program where we need to establish a database connection. You can simply use the import java.sql.static to import all the required libraries. And if you want to know exactly what you are importing, that you can import the individual classes over here. We'll be creating objects of these classes and interfaces to establish a connection with our database and to manipulate the data in our database. But for that we will need first to create our database. Now for creating a database you can have multiple options. There are different database management systems that are available to you, and most of them are open source DBMSs or database management systems. For example, there is Oracle, there is MySQL, there is SQL Server, and there are no SQL databases as well. But since this is not a course of the database, we only need to know how to establish a connection with a database in Java. Therefore, I will use the built-in DBMS of the Java that comes installed with the Java, that is the Java DB for this. Now if you go to the services that is available there on your NetBeans panel, in your services you will see these options over here. So you have the options of databases, web services, etc. You will go to the databases and there you will see the Java DB that is already installed over there. If you are using any other DBMS, then you can install the other drivers for all of these as well, or you can access the other DBMSs as well. But here I'm using the Java DB, therefore I will show you what driver we need for this. But this is where we will be creating our database first, then we will be getting the address of that database. As you can see over here, we have a bunch of databases over here, and these databases will have their tables in them. But first of all we need to start this server. Now this is an example of how we can access a database on a server. Since we are accessing the database on our own machine, on our own laptop or a computer, therefore the server is supposed to be on our local machine. Now I'm starting the server from over here. If it is not on or the server is not started, you will get an error that the server is not on or something. Then you need to start the server. So once the server is started, you will see, and then we can create a database in our server. It has started and ready to accept connections on port whatever. So we have started the server and now we are ready to create a database. For creating the database, you will need to provide the name of the database. For example, if you see these examples over here, you can see a books database, an employees or my database. It should be anything that is understandable to you as the name of a database. You will need to provide a username and a password. Now you will need to remember the username and the password since you will be needing this data to establish a connection with your database. So like say I can name it anything, my first database, and my username is maybe admn, and I provide the same password. But you need to remember this a password, since you will be using this to establish the connection with your database. Now you can see the message over here, creating Java DB database, my first database. It will check if a database of the same name exists on your server. If it does, it will show you the message, otherwise it will establish a link over here. Now this is the address that we can use to access our database on the server. Now you can see this link is broken at the moment, but we can connect it, and now as we can see over here, we will be able to add tables to our database. You can create tables by right clicking on this tables, and then we will be able to add the tables. Now adding the table, you are required to have columns now, because without columns obviously we will not have a table, and we are required to provide a table name. So my table, or it can be anything that suits your project. Then we can add columns to your database. So when you click on the add column over here, you are asked for the name of your column, and this is the same as creating your variables. When you are creating your variables, you are required to provide unique names to those variables. The columns, like the variables, will have a data type, it will have a name, and here we will provide a size for our columns, the default values, and then there are some constraints that we will be putting on our columns. These constraints, for example, if you want to allow a null value for our column, then we will choose this. If we want it to be unique, then we will choose this. And if we want it to be a primary key, then we will click on this one. We will choose this one. Now a primary key is something that we can use to identify our row from, like it is a unique value that will identify the individual records in our tables. For example, we have a unique identity card number or CNIC number that cannot be duplicated or assigned to two persons, different persons. Similarly, we have a registration number that cannot be a student registration number that cannot be provided to more than two students. That is the kind of a key that identifies an individual or record in our database. We can use the primary key to connect different different tables within our database, or join different tables in our database. If we look at the data types, here we have a boolean, we have a time, we have a decimal, as we understand, we have a long varchar, we have a date, timestamp, char for characters, then we have real data type, small int, big int, varchar, that is the variable character, that is where we provide a limit, that is initial size to our column, then that can be extended further. An integer, numeric, double, blob for big data types, are storing large values like images. Varchar will be using mostly for storing our string data, integer for int data, double for double data, and these are the varchar or char can be used for the string, storing the string data. Now let me show you the example of a sample table in our database. Let's say we have these databases. connected, and we'll be able to see the tables in our, so we have a table, and the columns in this table are the ID, the first name, the last name, and the book. This is an author's table. If you want to see the data in the table, then as we can see, an SQL query has been created for us. Select the asterisk is for all. From username.authors, we can simply use the authors. Authors is the table that we need to, or we want to select the data from. And now this is how a typical table in our relational database will look like. We have an ID, and this is we can see that is a primary key. If you see pk is yes, the data type of this is integer, you can see, and nullable is no. We need to remember that once we declare a column as the primary key, then we cannot make it null. It has to have a value. Now we have a first name, the data type is the name of the column is first name, the data type is varchar, the default length is 20, and we are not allowing null values for this column as well. We have a last name, the nullable is not allowed, and the rest of the details are similar to our first name. And then we have the book, we have the, and it is also of type varchar. The length that we have provided is 100 initially. So when you right click on this, it will allow us to create the table, and you can, let's say, add the table over here. Let me add a table, for example, of books, and I can add a column over here. Let's say ISBN, and I want it to be varchar, maybe with the initial size of 30, and I want it to be a primary key. So you can see that it will always be a unique, since we cannot have two records with the same primary keys. Like we cannot have two persons with the same CNIC number, or two students in a class with the same registration number. We can understand the kind of problems that it will create for us. That is why the primary key should be a unique, and it cannot be null. And this is all we need to create a column in our database. We can add another column, like I will add a column for the title of the book. I will want it to, maybe you can make it a long varchar, or you can make it a varchar, it's up to you. And the size, I will make it maybe the 100. Or now we need to remember that this is extendable, this size is extendable, and if you want to allow a null for it, if you do not want to allow a null for it, then you can uncheck this. If you do not want to allow a null for it, otherwise you can leave it as checked. And if you do not want the two books with the same title, then you can check this one. Otherwise you can, if you want to allow two books with the same title, then you can uncheck this. So if I click OK, I click OK on this one, the table has been created for me, as I can see over here. I can add data, I can add more columns to it later on. View data, as you can see, there is no data in this. If I want to add certain data or insert records, I can see over here, initially it is null. Now ISBN or as can be used as an identifier of the book, and it has its own format, and you can verify that format using regular expressions. But over here I will be using anything simply available to me, 123 A B C. So I have used this as an identifier, and my first book as the title of the book. You can see the SQL over here. This is the SQL query that you will, the SQL statement that you will need, or you can use to insert anything into this database. Now we will be using these queries from within our program, but over here we can see that we can use this interface to insert data into, or to create our tables and then to insert our data into those tables. You can add many rows as you need, and then once you click OK, the data will appear in your database or the table. Now once you have created your database and you have added tables to the database and you have added some sample data to it, you go back to your program, you create maybe a new project like you usually do, and here we are creating a simple program, we are writing a simple program. So you can select the main method file for it, use the main method file for it, and as I said that you will need to import some of these classes and libraries to be able to establish a connection with the database. Now if we want to establish a connection with the database, what we will do is, for example, you will need three types of data. These are the details that we will need to establish the connection. We'll need the address of our database. We'll need the username that we provided for that database. As I said that you need to remember that username, and you will need the password that you provided to establish connection with the database. Now for this address, we can go to our database again, and as we can see over here, we have this data address over here. Now whichever database you want to connect to, you can choose that, and you can copy or write this address from over here up until this point. As you can see, the name of the up to the name of the database. So this is the data that you will copy from here or write from here, and you will store it in this variable, or you can provide it as a string, but it is better to store it in a variable. Another thing to remember is that you will always write your connectivity code in a try-catch block. If you don't, then the compiler will remind it to you on its own. Then you store the username that you provided for that database in another variable, and the password that you provided in a third variable. All of these are of type string, and we do not want these to be changed accidentally or intentionally. Then we make these final. Now from our connection interface, we will create a connection object, and we will call the static method get connection of the driver manager in class, and we will pass these three variables to that method. This will establish a connection with our database. But for this to happen, we need to remember that we'll need to have the driver of JavaDB attached to our project or our program to which we are establishing the connection. And that we can do by clicking on the libraries. You can right click on the libraries and we'll click on the add jar folder or file. Now the thing that you need is the Derby client that is already comes installed with your Java, and you can find it by going to the program files where you have installed your Java. You can locate the Java folder, then you can go to the JDK folder. We'll go to the DB folder. As you can see over here, you will go to the lib and you will be able to locate the driver. Or here you can simply double click on it. Since I have already added this driver, so I do not need to add it again, but this is how you can add the jar file for as a driver for establishing the connection. If you are using any other DBMS than Java DB, then you can search and install the jar file for those DBMS systems. Now once we have established the connection, we need a statement object of the statement class to create a statement. Then we will be able to execute our SQL query through this statement. As you can see over here, we have created the SQL query where here this is a very simple query. It selects all the authors from the database. What we do here, that we execute this query using the execute query method of the statement object, and we store the resulting data in our result set object. As you can see over here, this is what we will be using the result set object for. And then we can go through the data. The value of the first column will be stored in the ID or local variable ID. As you can see over here, we can get the value from the columns. This is the first column. We can use the getInt method to get the integer value from our first column. If you remember, that was the ID column, and we can get that value using the rs object, and we can store it in our local variable. Then we can use the getString method to get the value from the second column, and we can store it in a local variable. Then we are getting the value from the third column, and we are storing it in a local variable. And similarly for our 4 columns. Then you can print your details using the printf statement over here and giving a format. And if I run this very simple code will be able to access data from our database on a console interface. As you can see over here, I'm able to access and display all the details of my table in my program over here. And this is since I'm able to retrieve all the tables because of this while loop. Since I'm running this loop, this will be going through the loop, or that next method goes through the checks if there is another record in the table, then it gets that record. So while there are records in the table, it will keep going until all of the records are retrieved one by one and printed one by one. So this was a simple code to establish a connection with the database and retrieve data from the database. In the next lecture, we'll have a more detailed look into the SQL statements.